Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to get on with part of the more formal part of the afternoon. So, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I'd like to thank ASPI, Stephen and Peter for the opportunity to sponsor today. So I was very pleased to be part of or support the ASPI organisation, and we recognise the important role you provide in developing intellectual debate around defence and defence policy. So thank you for the opportunity. I'm not going to do a SARB plug, but I am going to do a plug of a time. At this morning, myself and Matt, one of my colleagues, we got the opportunity to go out to Crace, 44 Bellenden Avenue, and look at the Soldier On facility out there. And I think for those of us in defence industry, I know there's a lot of ex-defence people that are out there. If you get the opportunity to go out there and have a look and possibly support that organisation, I think it's a noble cause and certainly something which I would encourage you to do. So that's my one plug, even from a SARB perspective this morning. My role is to introduce Mark Thomson, and I was thinking about this, and it's also going to be a short role because, I mean, Mark Thomson is a guy that within defence industry and within ASPI actually doesn't need any introduction. So without further ado, on behalf of SARB, Mark Thomson.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Let me begin with some thanks of my own. First of all, to SARB for sponsoring today's luncheon. Second, I get the credit for the budget brief, but in many ways it really is a team effort from ASPI as a whole, right from the get-go through the research and the production of the document and all the way through to the launch. So I'd like to sincerely thank my colleagues at ASPI for helping me. And I need to thank the Department of Defence as well. Each year we provide a draft copy of the brief for the Department of Defence to look at. They provide constructive comments back and corrections where necessary, and they did so again this year, probably to a fuller level than they have in the past, and very indebted for that. But of course I have to give the disclaimer, the budget brief and everything I'm about to say is not endorsed by or represents the Department of Defence. In fact, in many instances they may wish that different conclusions had been drawn. So, here we go. 2015 is set to be a big year for the Department of Defence. We've been promised a new white paper, a new defence capability plan, a new shipbuilding enterprise plan, a new defence industry policy statement. And sometime this year, or early next year, we're going to have a decision on Australia's future submarine. At the same time, Defence is about to undergo the second major reform program in this decade. This year's defence budget was really only a placeholder pending these major announcements that will occur later in the year. Nonetheless, with fiscal consolidation firmly on the back burner, Defence understandably did well in this year's budget. Nominal defence spending will increase by about $2 billion to reach $32.1 billion, an all-time high. In real terms, the year-on-year increase amounts to about 4.5%. As a share of gross domestic product, spending will reach 1.93% next financial year. Now, while this sounds impressive, especially in the context of the government's promise to boost defence spending to 2% of GDP, some context is needed. Without the accumulated foreign exchange supplementations in the budget, and without the additional funding for operational deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan, the GDP share would have been below 1.8%. And it would have been lower still had it not been for relatively slow growth in nominal GDP. However, and more importantly, next year's budget maintains a credible path that will allow the government to meet its promise of spending 2% of GDP on defence by the end of the decade, concluding in 2023-24. That's important not just because of the Prime Minister's election promise, but because 2% of GDP in 23-24 is going to be worth a lot more than 2% of GDP today. Roughly speaking, if the economy grows at about 2.5% per annum, it's going to be something like 17 or 18% larger in real terms than it is today. Here's a snapshot of where we've been and where we are at the moment. On current plans, this line here represents the cusp separating this financial year from the next financial year. And here's the 4 years of the forward estimates. Defence spending on these plans will fall next year, and then it will build itself back up to the end of the forward estimates. What I've done here is I've extrapolated up what would be necessary to reach 2% of GDP by the target date. And to do that, from the end of the forward estimates, you need about 4.5% growth each year, year on year, going forward above inflation. That's larger than the growth that occurred back in the 2000s when the Howard government increased defence spending at 3% of GDP. So it can't be taken as a given that that money will be readily absorbed by defence. Back in the 2000s, it was necessary to make some adjustments and from time to time to hand some money back, because it's difficult for defence and for defence industry to mobilise the ability to spend increasing amounts of money over an extended period of time. But there is a different way that the white paper could choose to increase defence spending to meet the target. That would be to ignore the presently planned drop next year and instead simply continue the increases. The result would be smaller and more manageable growth in funding, and the necessary rate of growth would only have to be about 3.3%, similar to what we had back in the 2000s. Indeed, even if it meant bringing money forward from the early 2000s, that is, delivering the same quantum of funds over the decade, and even undershooting on the 2% target in the final year, it might be worth doing, just to provide a more manageable and sensible funding envelope for defence and defence industry to work with. Remember, what matters is a realistic and manageable growth in defence funding to achieve a stronger defence force, not the contrived achievement of an arbitrary number in an arbitrary year. Indeed, it would defy common sense to, with a goal in sight of 2% of GDP out here, to reduce defence spending next year. We'd be taking one step backwards before we began to climb the mountain that we have to climb. Of course, there are fiscal realities that also need to be taken into account. This year's budget, federal budget, saw the prospective date of a return to surplus push out by another year to 2019-2020. Irrespective of whether the government begins to increase defence spending next year or waits a couple more years to begin the task of climbing up the hill, this will constitute a risk to defence funding. There's a binary political calculus about surpluses and deficits. At the moment, from a political perspective, it's easy to boost defence spending because the opportunity cost isn't a foregone surplus. It's a slightly larger deficit, which in the public's eye barely goes noticed. But later in the decade, the choice could very well be between reneging on a promise about defence funding or going to a federal election without a surplus in hand, when it might have been feasible to do so otherwise. No prizes for guessing what the outcome might be if that choice is faced by a future government. Nonetheless, taking the fiscal situation into account, it probably makes even more sense to continue increasing defence spending next year. By bringing defence investment forward, an investment in new equipment is probably the most fungible, the most movable part of the defence budget. Bringing that forward into this area here would free up the demand for cash around the time where a return to surplus is expected and actually make it easier for the government to get over the line. In that sense, it would be a win-win strategy. Defence could begin, and industry could begin, the task of building the 2015 White Paper's Defence Force sooner rather than later, and the government would have more breathing room to achieve a surplus when the time comes and it's feasible to do so. Balancing defence funding with fiscal imperatives is only one of the challenges facing defence and the government. To start with, there is of course the white paper to deliver. As I observed last year, 2% of GDP in the 2020s is going to be a lot of money. It's going to be a lot of money compared with the scale of the defence force we have at the moment. What I've done here is I've plotted the three principal components of the defence budget. Capital investment is the black line, operating costs are the red line, and the blue line is personnel costs. Between the two lines here we have the budgeted visibility of what's going on within defence. And some interesting things. You can see that personnel costs decrease slightly over the period. That will be helped along by the recent pay rise and the prospective pay rise for civilians. Operating costs, you can see here, rise a little bit, and investment spending goes up quite strongly. What I've done beyond there is I've looked at what credible historical trends are for both operating costs and personnel costs above inflation, and just extrapolated those out forward to the year 2023-2024. And what you find is personnel and operating costs increasing at 2.5% real and 3% real respectively, underneath a funding envelope which is working its way steadily towards 2% of GDP, actually allows a very large increase over time in capital investment. Now, I'm not saying that there's going to be a big increase in capital investment on that scale, because there's other options. The size of the force could be increased, and if that occurs, personnel and operating costs would also increase. But the bottom line is this: with 2% of GDP in the 2020s as the benchmark for defence spending, at the moment, given our projections of how the economy is going to grow, there's a lot of room to equip the ADF with more sophisticated equipment, and if the decision is taken, to even expand the force somewhat. So chances are the white paper will present an ambitious vision for the future force. Let's hope that the planning process pulling it together on the basis of nothing more than an arbitrary fraction of GDP comes up with a sensible plan. The risk is that with a planning process constrained by nothing more than a projection of the scale of GDP in a decade's time, that proposals, additions to the force structure of progressively less worth will nonetheless be able to get over the line and be included in the force. Certainly, Defence won't be handing any money back if they think that they've run out of ways to spend it sensibly. There's also a basket of technical issues to be resolved. It's easy to promise that defence spending will be a certain share of GDP in a certain year, but foreign exchange movements and the vagaries of economic growth make it difficult to construct a funding model that does so without lumbering defence with financial risk. Let me just give you a couple of examples here. What I've done here is I've taken in today's dollars the projected size of the defence budget in 2023-2024, it's about $42 billion, and I've assumed that at that point in time that the Australian dollar is worth 80 cents US. And I've asked the question, given the exposure that defence has to foreign exchange, which is pretty much known, it's been disclosed, you can then work out how the buying power of that amount of money would vary depending upon the exchange rate with the US dollar. What you find is, unsurprisingly, if the dollar falls down to 50 cents, as it did back in the year 2000, then the buying power of the budget decreases substantially. Or if we go to the heady heights of $1.10, which it did back in 2011 when there was a spike in the terms of trade, then the buying power is way up here. Out of a budget of 42 billion, the variation here is 12.7. Here's the problem. At this point in time, the people in finance and in defence planning the white paper have to know how much money there'll be so that they can put in place plans for a force structure to build. but they don't know what the Australian dollar is going to be worth in 2023, 2024. They've got to make an assumption on it. If they're too conservative, they might undershoot the 2%. If they're too pessimistic, they'll give defence more than 2%. Here's another problem, another technical problem that has to be surmounted. What we have here are my estimate of what 2% of GDP for 10 years is worth, that is the decade beginning 2020 and going forward, 2030, based on the economic growth projections of the 2003 intergenerational report and the 3 successive intergenerational reports that were issued by governments. As you can see, over time, in fact over only 12 years, Treasury's projections of the size of the Australian economy have varied substantially. This once again factors in to the difficulty of trying to plan defence on the basis of a share of GDP. To cut a long story short, the sensible approach would be to fix a funding envelope with GDP share as a planning benchmark. Do it now, once and for all, take 2% of GDP, put it in a box and put a lock on it, and focus on the funding envelope that was put together in this white paper and use that as a firm planning basis which will allow defence to get on with building the force that's affordable within that envelope and will allow Treasury and Finance to plan the Commonwealth's finances out into the next decade with a known demand from defence rather than one that will fluctuate with foreign exchange and economic growth. The government has described its forthcoming white paper and its accompanying plan for the ADF with a range of objectives, and I've collected them up here. Let me go through them. Fully costed, externally assured, achievable, affordable, credible, realistic, properly funded, and enduring. That last one's going to be a hard one. That's a tall order to deliver. But if the new white paper is to, as the Minister has said it must, restore the compact that rightly exists between the government and its defence force, there's going to be needed to be another adjective added to that list. And that adjective is transparent. If the government wants to be believed when it claims that its plan is credible, affordable and properly funded, it'll have to show us the money. Past white papers have taken different approaches to this problem. Without doubt, the Howard government's 2000 effort set the gold standard. It provided a decade's worth of overall funding guidance in the document and backed it up with a detailed breakdown of new funding over the decade in the budget that followed. It then published a detailed decade-long public defence capability plan in 2001, which was the original and the best. All the ones that came after it were watered down and successively more opaque and contained less detail. The degree of funding transparency in the 2015 Defence White Paper will be a litmus test of how serious the government is about its commitment to defence. But doing so will come at a cost. The cost will be that they will be able to be held to account for either delivering or not delivering on their promise. The Howard government wasn't afraid of being held to account. Let's hope that the Abbott government isn't afraid either. Given the controversy surrounding sub-inflation pay rises awarded to the ADF, in this year's budget brief, we've tried to benchmark ADF salaries against a range of comparators. I want to show you one of the comparisons we did, and it's a comparison that was conducted using purchasing power parity exchange rates between Australia, Canada, the United States and the United Kingdom. Now, this is not a perfect comparison, it's at best indicative, but it tells an interesting story that I'd like to convey to you. What we have here is the relative salaries of enlisted personnel and of officers. Our comparator nations are in grey and Australia is in red. Now, as you would expect for an egalitarian country like Australia, we pay our enlisted personnel as well or better than any of the comparator nations. It's probably no surprise. It probably reflects the fact that we have relatively high wages across the economy as a whole, whereas other countries tend to have a sharper rise. When it comes to officers, pretty much we're in the middle of the pack. The lower ranked officers do a bit better in Australia, but middle of the pack for most of it, until we get to Lieutenant Generals and Generals, and then we go off the chart. But that's another story for another day. As interesting as these benchmarks are, they're not the final word on the matter. You can't conclude from this anything sensible about the adequacy of the pay rise that the ADF received late last year with a supplementation earlier this year. The adequacy or otherwise will be decided by the labour market. The decisions that will be made by present serving ADF members about whether to continue serving, and the decisions that will be made by potential recruits over the next three years will pass a verdict on the adequacy of the wage rise, irrespective of any comparison that I might pull together and bury in a document. However, I think it's worth making the following point. The government is undertaking a brave experiment with the ADF pay deal that it's put through. The latest Treasury projections for wage growth in the economy over the next 3 years are respectively 2.5%, 2.75% and 2.75%. The government is counting on ADF members sticking around despite increasingly better prospects in the civilian economy. They might get away with it. Transition costs are high for an individual in moving from military service to civilian life, and it should be said that loyalty is a very tangible thing for members of the Australian Defence Force. There's still a problem though. The trouble is that for 4 years in a row, the Australian Defence Force has fallen short of its target strength by somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 people. What I have in this graph here is actual recorded results for the strength of the ADF, and each of these lines here with a date is what the plan was. You can see here back in 2009 we had a plan which was in fact exceeded by what occurred. But that ended, and from about 2011-12 onwards, 1, 2, 3, 4 years, we've come nowhere near what was planned, and successive expectations have been frustrated 1 year after the other. Now, it's possible that this outcome here reflects poor workforce planning within Defence, a failure to properly anticipate separations, the failure to properly put in place large enough recruiting targets. We should hope that's the case. The other alternative is that ADF employment was losing its lustre prior to the latest workplace agreement. If that's what's happened, this is one hell of a time to be conducting an experiment. Moving on now to Defence reform. Once again, Defence is going to be reorganised and reformed, this time following a first principles review headed by former Rio Tinto head David Peever. With 76 separate recommendations, the first principles review is going to change the way Defence is structured and the way Defence does business across a very broad front. Key changes include the reintegration of the Defence Materiel Organisation into Defence proper. It had previously been a prescribed agency which was quasi-independent of Defence. And there's also the disbanding of the Capability Development Group. The Capability Development Group, principally military officers whose job it is to prepare proposals for future investment. They produce the business cases for the major capability development initiatives that the department takes forward to government. If nothing else, the reforms will shake Defence up and remove some of the managerial overheads that accumulated during the 2000s when funding was easy to find. They'll also provide the opportunity to improve that long list of things we hear about every time there's a review of Defence: governance, accountability, planning, performance management, risk management, budget discipline. But it'll only provide an opportunity. Every review we've had of Defence has promised to remediate these important areas, and yet here we are again once again identifying them as problems and hoping that this time we've got a solution. The merits of many of the changes are far from self-evident in the first principles review. If they were self-evident, they would have occurred a long time ago. The best that can be said is that they're new ideas and they're worth a try. In the long run, going back over the decades, it's pretty clear that a lot of what goes on in defence reform is trial and error. We try things, if it works, we keep it. If it doesn't work, we jettison it and we try something else. Defence Materiel Organisation is a case in point. Once upon a time, those functions were within the department. We did an experiment, put them outside of the department. Now they've been brought back in. You don't have to be a pessimist to see some risks in some of the changes that are ahead for defence. By restructuring the department into two parts, I hope you can see this here, under the new organisational structure, the department is literally divided in two, one part reporting to the Secretary and another part reporting to the Chief of the Defence Force. This is different to any arrangement that's been in place since the Tang reforms. Normally, the wiring diagram has the Secretary and the Chief of the Defence Force at the top and a more or less mismatch of integrated organisational parts below them. This new arrangement divides tasks between the civilian side and the military side. Now, only time will tell whether this is a workable approach, but the risk here is that with the contestability mechanisms that are being put in place, which will see the civilian side contesting the proposals that are put forward from the military side, the risk is that cooperation will not occur to the extent that it should and to the extent that it has in the past. Defence, in my experience, is at its best when its civilian and military parts are working together in close cooperation. Another area where there's risks is the new capability development process. We've been told that the new capability and acquisition group, that is, the group that will take on the role previously done by the Defence Materiel Organisation, will also take on the role of most of what was done by the capability development group, that is, the preparation of business cases for first and second pass approval of projects. Yet at the same time, the people in capability development group who used to perform this function are going to be sent back into the service headquarters and to the Vice Chief's office within the department. You've got to ask whether this has been thought through, where a function goes one direction and the people who used to perform the function have gone another direction. And we're talking about 120, 130 people here. Skilled people who've been working in this area, maybe on their second posting, developing the skills that are necessary for business case analysis. Well, we'll find out soon enough. There's two mega projects to be decided over the next couple of years. As I already mentioned, the replacement submarines sometime around the end of this year, and then the future frigates. That's going to test a system which is being profoundly reorganised at the moment. And just to make things more interesting, to add a degree of difficulty, as if it was a gymnastic event, we're going to remove the top layer of DMO from the equation and downgrade the head of that organisation in its new form, capability and acquisition, to a position of Deputy Secretary. On the positive side, by not promising a treasure trove of implausible savings, the First Principles Review has avoided the pitfalls of the past. To the contrary, although some modest personnel reductions have been proposed, the review is quite open about the need for investment in a whole range of areas to ensure that Defence has the corporate infrastructure to do what needs to be done. It's entirely possible that the cost of the additional investment in things like management information systems will exceed any of the savings that arise. That should not be seen as a sign of failure, but rather a sign of maturity of an organisation that's facing up to what's going to be necessary by way of investment to achieve high performance. Finally, let me say something about shipbuilding, my favourite topic. In late May, in fact when I'd almost finished the budget brief, the government announced the results of its forensic review of the troubled air warfare destroyer project. A very sobering picture emerged. There's an additional 12-month delay and a cost blowout of $1.2 billion now expected. As the Finance Minister observed, we're now paying $3 billion each for ships we could have brought overseas for $1 billion. The three vessels will now be delivered somewhere between 30 and 33 months later than originally planned. A rescue plan has been put in place that will see either a managing contractor or partnering arrangement put in place to insert further expertise in the government-owned shipbuilder ASC. This potentially injects a fourth party into the mix alongside the existing three alliance partners executing the project, ASC, Raytheon and Defence. It's not clear that a fourth party is going to make things any easier. Importantly, this move stops well short of putting a private sector firm in charge of completing the project. That might sound like a radical suggestion, but that's exactly what the government did back in the 1980s, when it had two FFG frigates languishing in the then government-owned shipyard in Williamstown. It sold the firm to the private sector. They came in, completed the two FFGs in quick order, then moved on and executed the Anzac program and delivered them on time and on budget. It may be that this more drastic approach was off the table because the alliance framework was simply too tortured a knot to try and unpick. Notwithstanding the ongoing problems with the air warfare destroyer project, the government has said that it will release an enterprise-level naval shipbuilding plan later this year, which will, I quote, provide for the long-term future of the Australian naval shipbuilding industry. Really? We've had the Finance Minister tell us that we're getting 3 vessels for the price of 9 and we're going to redouble our bets. In fairness, those stark figures need to be put in context. Local industry can rightly claim that they've been unfairly tainted by the poor performance of a government-owned entity in the form of ASC. Nonetheless, surely we need credible assurance that domestic construction in Australia can produce vessels at something approaching an internationally competitive price before we sign up to what will amount to tens of billions of dollars of domestic naval construction. At first glance, the recent released RAND report on Australian naval shipbuilding provides a way ahead in the form of a continuous build program. However, on closer examination, the RAND report fails to muster a plausible case for the strategies it puts forward. A continuous build program would require either a larger fleet or more frequent replacement of vessels than is the norm. Either way, the additional cost would amount to billions of dollars. With so much extra money sloshing around due to the 2% of GDP promise, the very real risk is it will end up expanding the size of the Navy to meet local industry's demand for work. The tail will wag the dog and the taxpayer will pick up the bill. Let me try and bring all of these disparate issues together in a conclusion. This is likely to be the most important year for Australian defence policy and planning, at least since the year 2000. And all of the issues I've gone through today are really only about the mechanics of funding and delivering capability. There's actually a whole range of potentially more difficult geostrategic issues confronting the government, from Iraq to the South China Sea. The forthcoming Defence White Paper will need to explain Australia's response to these worrying developments. And will also need to show how the billions of dollars of new equipment that will be outlined in the Defence White Paper will help Australia deal with the risks that these developments portend. As I said at the start, it's going to be a very big year for defence. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mark. Truly comprehensive. You never disappoint. We're now open to Q&A, but before I proceed, could I make a special mention of two of our guests here today, former Defence Minister Peter Reith and current Shadow Assistant Minister for Defence and Vet Affairs David Feeney. Particular welcome to you, gentlemen. Now, we're going to allow people to ask Mark just about anything on his report or on his address today. Perhaps I might begin, Mark, by taking you to the issue of transparency. Given that we have some very senior contributors to the Defence White Paper with us today, what are the elements of transparency you would like to see written into the 2015 Defence White Paper?
I'd like to see two things. First of all, I'd like to see, as occurred back in the 2000 White Paper, a clear delineation of how much funding there will be going forward, either for a decade or for 2 decades. For my own personal interest, I'd like to see it broken into personnel, operating and capital costs, because that would allow a very quick back-of-the-envelope credibility check to find out whether it hung together as a coherent whole. And I think I could speak on behalf of industry that what industry wants out of the White Paper is a defence capability plan that they can use to plan their business around. A defence capability plan which is explicit enough about what the government's trying to achieve that they can go back to their head offices and make their internal business case for going forward and doing what's necessary to win the work that's coming on downstream.
Thanks. Over to you, ladies and gentlemen. Could I ask people to identify themselves? We have a couple of roving mics. Yes, sir. Someone down the back there.
G'day, Mark, David Rowe from the Fairfax Press. I'm sorry, well, thanks for your great work, and I'm sorry if I distracted you by flinging open the door to your left halfway through while you're on the roll. There seems a real prospect that Australia is going to adopt a stronger, more hawkish, what you will, stance towards China's territorial ambitions, and that could even perhaps be sort of enshrined somehow in the White Paper. I wonder if you could speculate a little for us what that will mean for the defence budget over the next 10 years. Does it mean, will it affect the sort of 2% target? I know you're dubious about the 2% target, but could you give us a sense of how that would track in terms of funding if we go down that path?
It's a good question, David. I'm going to give you a pretty generic answer though, because I think the answer really needs to be put in broader terms. At any point in time, and notwithstanding what I said about putting forward projections of funding to allow defence to plan, that still holds and needs to be done. The reality is, at any point in time, governments are juggling 100 different priorities. At the moment, for example, this government or anyone who might replace them for the next few years will have to juggle the complexities of, on the one hand, investing in defence to build up a stronger defence force, which there appears to be broad agreement across the political spectrum on, and also retiring debt, so that just as we retire strategic risk by developing military capability, we retire economic risk by running down the debt, so that we're in a better position in case there's a repeat of the global financial crisis downstream. Now, what does that mean for defence spending? Well, it means that on either of those two fronts, if there's a clash in the South China Sea, chances are that will make the government and the Australian electorate much more sympathetic to increasing defence spending and doing so more quickly rather than slowly. On the other hand, if the Dow Jones drops by 30% tomorrow and we have a repeat of the financial crisis and everyone gets their superannuation update in the mail and finds they've got to work another 5 years before they can retire, then priorities are going to shift towards the economic side of the spectrum. As is always the case, and as is appropriate in a democracy, the priorities that the government has will shift over time as the situation changes and as public sentiment responds to that changing situation.
Paul.
Paul Bebb, the Australian National University. Thank you as usual, Mark, for a very professional and objective and indeed informative address. The organisation charts that you referred to starts to look ominously like what we faced in the late 80s, but then a nice approach under the Secretary of CDF. I hope that is not the case, because I think we've moved a long way since then. But relevant to that, would you explain to us in the first principles review, what do you see the role of contestability and red flags? The VCDF, if I'm right, has that with regard to force structure, but the new DepSec policy and intelligence, which starts to look like my own job, DepSec B, has a red flag with regard to capability, technical and financial risk, or am I wrong? And if so, how is it going to work?
Now, Paul, I think you've described the scheme put forward in the first principles review pretty accurately. The Vice Chief, although it says he or she will have a veto on forced development issues, he or she will chair the committee that makes the recommendations. So that sort of comes with the territory. What's more interesting is the veto given to the Deputy Secretary Policy and Intelligence over a range of issues. Well, let me make two comments, which I hope will be consistent, but they'll show the tension in this. The reason why contestability is important is because no matter how clever you are, if you're locked in a room with a number of people who have the same institutional imperatives as you and operate under the same incentives as you can convince yourself of anything. That's just a fact of life. And in fact, intelligence organisations go to great efforts to prevent this risk from occurring. In terms of capability development proposals, the way to stop groupthink from leading people down very narrow paths, not fully considering all of the options, or perhaps ignoring some of the downsides to the preferred options, the way to do that, and the way we used to do it in the past, is to have some people come and ask some questions, to contest the advice that was going forward, and to put the pressure on for the business case to be improved and made more robust. So I'm a big fan of contestability, and I was very heartened to see that the first principles review has included that as one of the principles as how they want to operate. But to my mind, contestability works like this. You have a decision maker, in this case the Vice Chief of the Defence Force. You have some people proposing what they want to do, the services, and you have some people from intelligence and policy who will go, oh, wait a minute, what about this? And the contesting is a dialogue, it's a discussion. And at the end of the day, a decision maker makes a decision which would take the form of a recommendation to the CDF and Secretary, which would then in turn result in a recommendation to the government. I think that's workable. It is not workable to have vetoes. You cannot, at one and the same time, put someone in charge of the committee and make them responsible for formulating advice to the government on forced development and give someone else in the organisation a red card to put a veto on it. My expectation is that the maturity and experience of the people in defence will result in the organisation operating and contestability operating the way I described. The day someone pulls a red card is the day that framework there begins to fall apart.
And it may mean that ASPI's role in contestability of advice becomes more significant. Please, David.
Thank you. David Feeney. Mark, I want to return you to shipbuilding, that old conversation you and I returned to, and reflecting on the fact that the winter review remains confidential to government, has not yet been released, that the RAND report obviously had particular flaws, not the least of which was the charter in it declaring that submarines would be sourced overseas, and then most recently the spectacle of a government raining on its own parade and releasing the forensic audit on the eve of the launch of Hobart, where the $9 billion number was landed, and you repeated it in your presentation today, but when you strip fixed costs out of that number, the first destroyer was $1.4 billion, the third destroyer was $1 billion. We can only imagine what a fourth might have been. In that context, what do you discern about where we are now and what the immediate future is for our shipbuilding industry, because I think we would all have to agree that this is a government that has taken a particularly muscular view to the shipbuilding debate, and a controversial one.
Shipbuilding has frustrated successive governments, all the way back to 2002, when the then Howard government tried to put forward a naval shipbuilding plan. And the tension, to my mind, derives from the reality of the size of the Royal Australian Navy. If the Royal Australian Navy was 50% larger, it'd be a no-brainer. You'd have a continuous build program. But the Australian Navy is not 50% larger yet. The white paper may yet close the gap. But with a Navy of the size we have today, you really have a choice between, when it comes to building vessels. You either build them in country and accept that you're going to incur high fixed costs to set up the project, to initiate it, and then close it down at the end and wait for the next project. And that's not a disrespect. That's not necessarily the wrong way to do it. That might be the best way to do it once you crunch the numbers. Or you go overseas and buy the vessels from someone who's got a production line, has already made the fixed cost investment, and you simply pay the marginal cost for the additional units. That's the way we buy aircraft these days. The only reason we continue to do it for ships is, on the one hand, there's so few international programs producing ships that would be compatible with our requirements that it's hard to key into one. And the other one is, frankly, there's a lot of politics involved in the labour-intensive task of building vessels. So where do we go from here? Well, the government says we're going to have a naval shipbuilding enterprise plan. They have a big choice here, and the choice is whether to continue with a stop-start approach, where from time to time they reserve the right to go overseas. And if you do that, you're going to incur fixed costs for stopping and starting your projects, but you're going to have competitive pressure by going overseas to other people's yards from time to time, which will keep people on their toes. Or they can boost the size of the Navy, the surface Navy principally. I think submarines are an interesting and other subject that we can talk about later. But with the surface Navy, you can boost the size of the surface Navy, try and go to a continuous build program, but then you've got a problem. Then you have, whether it's government owned or privately owned, you have a monopoly supplier. Now, that's just a reality, because we can't sustain two competitive shipbuilding entities in Australia and play them off one against the other. We're going to have a monopoly. But if you're going to have a monopoly, you've got to think really hard about how you're going to regulate that monopoly and drive performance and get productivity gains over time as you go forward. And the real danger is that entity, be it government owned or be it privately owned, will, on current experience, have lots of allies in the unions and the state governments who will lobby to get themselves a larger share of the pie and to keep pressure off them. So whichever way they go, it's going to be a difficult choice.
Further questions? Yes, please, ma'am. Thanks, Rosie.
Hello, my name is Glenda Parker. I'm the Director of Global Strategy in Strategic Policy in the Department of Defence. My question is to do with the palatability of the defence budget with the Australian public. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about the strength of the social compact between the community and the military and Department of Defence, and whether the budget now and the future budgets have been sufficiently explained to the Australian public to allow them to understand the imperatives behind it, obviously noting that the white paper hasn't been released yet. Thank you.
Wow, that's a big question. I don't think this. You're right. The white paper isn't out yet, so we can't judge how saleable a proposition it will be and its saleability will depend upon the circumstances that prevail when it arrives. Back to my point about another financial crisis or a clash in the South China Sea would elicit a very different response from the electorate. Let me make a more general point, once again, as I did with David's question, because I think the general point's the more important one. At this point earlier on, I posed the dilemma the government has between strategic risks and building the Defence Force and economic risks and paying down debt. Well, there's actually a third side to what's actually a triangle, and that's an electorate. An electorate which has its own aspirations, which may not necessarily align with paying down debt or investing in defence. Now, I think what we've seen over the last couple of years in Australia and increasingly in other countries is that Western electorates are becoming much more volatile. There's still bases behind each of the major parties in Western nations, but the middle ground, the swinging voters, have become more numerous and more ready to switch allegiance from one side to the other. What does that mean? It means that governments have a much harder job of selling the story about paying down debt or building up the Defence Force, or for that matter investing in education, because whatever they do, they're going to have to put $1 on the table into one of the piles, and that dollar has to come out of a taxpayer's pocket, either in increased taxation or indirectly through reduced services to that taxpayer. So I think it's going to be very difficult in Australia and elsewhere for governments to formulate and sell good policy, because we're now entering a regime where a lot of the certainties about how people would vote have evaporated, and there's a lot more. If you look at the state elections over the last 18 months or so, two of them were wildly swinging from what the previous outcome was. It makes it very difficult for governments to formulate and execute good policy.
One down, right down the back there in the corner.
Thanks, Mark. Brendan Nicholson from The Australian. At the ASPI submarine conference, a German representative popped up and announced that Germany could build Australia 12 submarines for $20 billion. And since then, the French and the Swedes both agreed that they could do the same. People have talked about signing fixed price contracts, being able to build the submarines in a foreign country or in Australia, or a hybrid version which would be building some overseas, perhaps training our workforce and then finishing them off here. And that would satisfy the political requirements in Australia as well. Now, how feasible is that? Do you believe that they're having a lend of this, or do you believe that an efficient overseas operation could actually come to Australia and produce the submarines on time for that sort of money?
Let me preface it by saying that I've been in this job long enough to remember when the air warfare destroyers were only going to cost us $4.5 million for 3. Then it was going to cost us 6. Then it went to contract and it was going to cost us 8. And now we've barely got one ship in the water and it's going to cost us 9. So I'm very wary about what salespeople tell me and what I read off glossy brochures. I don't know whether you can deliver a submarine program of 12 vessels for $20 billion or not. I do know it's feasible to export production technology and build submarines because we did it. We did it with the Collins. We also did it with the Anzac frigate. We brought in surface combatant technology. So it's not beyond the wit of Australian industry to work with overseas counterparts to bring in the knowledge and the skills and the designs and execute a project here. As to what it will cost, you won't know that until you sign on the dotted line, and perhaps not even then. If you sign on the dotted line with a special purpose vehicle that's been put together as a consortium which has no balance sheet, well, you hope that they deliver it on time and on budget. Otherwise, the cost overrun's coming out of your back pocket. So you won't even know till the end of the project. The only way you can be sure of signing up for a particular price is if you're signing up with a corporate entity or a national entity which has a balance sheet of sufficient depth to cover the cost overrun. In the past, Australia's found some corporate entities that fitted the bill. The AW&C project, Wedgetail, was a fixed price contract and Boeing was held to it. It ran over budget, but the Australian taxpayer didn't have to foot the bill. It's going to be much harder to find someone who's willing to carry the risk for a major project like the submarines that's going to be counted in the tens of billions.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, our time is nearly exhausted, so I'm happy to take two more very brief questions. There's one just there at the back table. Thank you.
Afternoon, Mark. Trevor Thomas, crunching the same numbers as you, now writing a few paragraphs for Phantom Media. I just wanted to pick up the question the lady had here about the social compact. It's not new that the figures that came out just before the Hobart launch were around. There was a Auditor General's report in 2012 which basically said that for it was costing us $1.60 instead of $1 for the same ships. At the same time, when we now analyse some of the figures around the federal budget, we often overlook the game the state governments play in this compact. It's not unknown that many state governments in Australia bring subsidies to the play in the various contests for projects to go to their state. In South Australia, it's somewhere of $300 to $350 million that's been invested in the tech port. There seems to be this God-given expectation that they should get every naval project in Australia, despite the fact that the cross-subsidy to the state of South Australia for these projects is just humongous. Why should someone in Queensland pay $1.60 for something that could be done for $1 in Spain, or maybe $1.30 in Queensland?
Would you like to move your question?
Yes, I'm sorry, it's a complex question. So the point I want to put to you is that there seems to be no discipline here. And if state governments are going to be in the project and part of the bid, what do you feel to applying the discipline to there? So if a state government actively lobbies for a project, puts money in to invest and attract a project, then should it not have some discipline in the delivery of the project? And if it does go over time and cost the Australian taxpayer more, actually they should foot the bill, and not me.
The gentleman here, I think, had a question. Thanks.
Ian Lavrock, the Royal Institution of Naval Architects. Mark, I was just wondering, you mentioned the larger fleet of R&D vessels might get us into a sustainable shipbuilding pattern. Perhaps you might want to reflect on why it is we don't include other government agencies as part of that relation, and also why the fairly sizable repair and sustainment market isn't included also.
First of all, Trevor's question. If state governments want to provide a financial guarantee for Commonwealth projects, that would sweeten the deal and make it more attractive. That's up to them to consider the merits of. I don't think it makes any sense for the Commonwealth to be dictating what potential suppliers do or don't do. If it so happens that the government of South Australia wishes to subsidise shipbuilding, well, as a federal taxpayer, I'm more than happy to accept their money. By the same token, if the government of Spain wishes to subsidise their shipyards, I'm more than happy to give some work to them and let the Spanish taxpayer pay for part of the Royal Australian Navy. I think that the federal government should just look at the numbers, look at value for money, and make a decision. On the question of a sustainable shipbuilding industry, it's true, irrespective of whether we build vessels, we're going to have to maintain vessels here. At the moment, the people who are maintaining vessels, there's some overlap between the two groups, and there's some overlap in skills, the set to work and that sort of thing. Actual fabrication of hulls, a lot of the stuff is pretty much disjoint, and there isn't a lot of overlap. I went through and did a detailed analysis of the RAND report on naval shipbuilding. They concluded that the repair and maintenance function was best considered as a separate function, separate activity, although they, anyone would acknowledge that if you're building ships, you're going to have more people with the skills and you're going to be more able to do it. The real question is, from a cost-benefit point of view, do I save sufficient money in terms of through-life support by building vessels to offset the premium I might pay by building the vessels in country or not? And you'd have to crunch the numbers, but I'd be doubtful that you'd make a big saving by doing that.
Well, as I said earlier, ladies and gentlemen, Mark simply never disappoints. Thanks for joining us today. We're all far better informed. We have a far greater understanding of the 2015 defence budget. Thanks to Saab, thanks to Karen Edwards and the ASPI team for putting today together. But on your behalf, could I say to Dr. Mark Thomson and his team, thanks for an outstanding effort, absolutely authoritative, absolutely definitive, and as always, it will have an impact in the debate on defence budgeting for the foreseeable future. Ladies and gentlemen, could we thank Mark and his team by acclamation?